So good afternoon. Thank you very, very much. And it's very nice to be here with all of you. It's very rare that people like us, the research group that we'll be talking to today, who deal with Jews who lived 800 years ago, have such a direct contact between the research we do and everyday life. Usually when people are interested in what we do, they say, so how is it relevant? And we sometimes have to work a little bit hard to explain how what we study 800 years ago is so relevant to our lives. And I think with the latest events, we've had a very good example of how past examples of history really connect so directly to our lives. So what I want to do now is tell you a little bit about the series we have before us, about the group that will be speaking to you, and then give a brief introduction to our topic, the Black Death and the Jews. And I think a lot of the connections between the events today and the events in the past will become very evident as we speak. I am going to share my screen with you now, and we will begin. So thank you to Tamar for inviting us to speak today. I am Elisheva Baumgarten. I teach at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and I head a research group that's called Beyond the Elite, Jewish Daily Life in Medieval Europe. And we have been working for the past 4 years to try to understand what daily life was like for the Jews. Now, in fact, what stood behind our research project is to some extent the opposite of what we'll be talking about with you. Usually when people think of the European Middle Ages, they think of the Middle Ages as a very difficult period for Jews, a period in which they knew many catastrophes, the Black Death being among the central ones of them. And one of the purposes of our research group was really to try to understand what daily life was like for the Jews. Not to talk in stereotypes, not to talk in terms of what's been called a lachrymose history, a history of horrible, horrific, sad events, but really to understand how Jews who saw themselves as part of medieval European culture found their places in medieval Europe. As part of this goal, 4 years ago, I received a grant from the European Research Council, and I was lucky enough to be able to open up a group of a team of researchers that includes postdocs, doctoral students, and MA students, and we've all been working together for the past 4 years. As part of our work, we've traveled to Europe, we've met with specialists from around the world, we've hosted multiple international scholars. The idea being, try to understand how the Jews of medieval Europe really lived within medieval Europe. Not as a temporary place, not as a haven where they were, as a place where they were waiting to reach a haven, such as the land of Israel in modern Zionism, and that's the story that was often told about them, but really as part of the medieval world. And as a way of introduction, I want to tell you a little bit today, and we want to speak today mainly about before the Black Death, what life was like for the Jews before the catastrophe hit, although I will be talking about what happened during the Black Death in some general terms. So we study the Jews of medieval Ashkenaz between approximately 1100 to 1500. This is the period after the First Crusade when some Jewish communities were hurt by the Crusaders on their way to the Holy Land, but a period in which we know that Jewish communities knew tremendous growth and creativity. Our group studies Northern Europe, so we deal with the Jews of England, Northern France, and Germany. This is a period that anyone who's familiar with the Jewish bookshelf knows many of the people who wrote the works of the period. Rashi, the Tosafists are all part of what we study. And this was a period in which the Jews enjoyed tremendous freedom in the European cities. There were no ghettos. They lived next door to their Christian neighbors. They were part of the urban settings, part of the urban economy, part of growing urban culture. And we know that the Jewish communities, even if they were small in the numbers in each community, so there were sometimes 10 families, sometimes 20 families, sometimes 40 families, sometimes 100 or 150 families, they were very much part of the urban fabric. Just to give you an idea of what happened in Europe during this period, I want to very quickly show you 3 maps. I know you won't be able to see all the details on the maps, but you don't need to. All you need to look at is the dots. So here's a map from around 1000. This is the kind of cradle of Ashkenazic Jewry. You can see the 3 communities, Mainz, Worms, and Speyer, often known as Kehilot Shum, 3 of the oldest communities that were founded in the 9th or 10th century. And you can see that there are other cities around, but none of them really have Jews, maybe one over here. And if you continue, you can see, if we follow the settlement for the years afterwards, how there are more and more cities with Jews. By the late 13th century, you can see how many Jewish settlements there were in this area. So you can see that Jewish communities and Jewish presence in just this one small area of Germany grew tremendously. And if I were to show you a map, the entire map of Europe, you would see this even more so. But each and every dot that you can see here on this map required an agreement. It required an agreement between the ruler of the city, whether it was an emperor, whether it was a nobleman, whether it was a bishop in many cases, an agreement that allowed the Jews to settle in that city, that gave them the privilege of living there. And we know from these different cities, and here you can see a map of Speyer, one of the earliest cities we know of. It was settled in 1084 by the Jews during a period of tremendous expansion when the cathedral of Speyer was built beautifully, and so were some of the Jewish buildings there. We know that the Jews settled within the city, within the walls of the city. They usually received the right to have a cemetery. You can see the cemetery here on the map, but you can also see how close the Jews were to the center, to the hub of the city, how close the synagogue and the mikveh are to the cathedral. So Jews settled in these cities, and when I said no ghettos, I meant that they were at the heart of these cities. They were part of the commerce, of the traffic, of everyone who came in and out of the city. They really felt like inhabitants and like citizens of these cities. Here you can see an example from Worms. In this case, you can see very nicely that the Jews often lived together in one part of the city, but they had neighbors who were not necessarily Jewish. And in the case of Worms, you can see that anyone who entered the city had to come in through the gate near the Jewish quarter, and they would pass by the merchants there, the businessmen there. And once again, you can see that they were very much a part of what was going on there. You can also see that the Jewish cemetery was over here. This meant that any time that the Jews had to lead their dead to burial, they would walk through the entire city, feeling safe to do so. Once again, what I'm trying to emphasize is that during the 12th and the 13th century, the Jews felt at home in their medieval surroundings. So this is the reality in which the Black Death hit in the mid-14th century. The Black Death, a pandemic in some ways like the pandemic we know today, came from the East. It came with travelers, with merchants who came from the East to Europe, and it started hitting different cities in Europe, making its way northwards towards the end of 1347 and really coming to the cities in Germany, in France, and other places during 1348 and 1349. Much like Corona today, people knew the disease was coming before it came. In other words, there were already rumors that there was a disease going around, that you should be careful, that people are dying from a plague. So much like today, there was time to prepare. There was time to think about how one could defend oneself according to the medical ideas, according to different theories of humors, different theories of medicine that existed in the time. And there was also a time to get reorganized. And what we know is that the Jews during this period had different fates depending on where they were. In some cities, the Jews were protected by the local governing bodies, whether they were certain noble families, whether they were bishops, whether they were other people within the city, and nothing happened to the Jews. In other places, we know that the Jews were often accused and blamed with different accusations, and they suffered very, very difficult fates. But before I say a word about what happened during the period of the Black Death, I want to say a few words about before the Black Death. Already during the 50 or 60 years leading up to the Black Death, Jewish fates or the Jewish communities in different places were being decided in new ways. This was after, during the 13th century, the Catholic Church had become especially strong. There were a lot of anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish ideas in the air. We know of the blood libels. We know of different host accusations. And we know that the reality on the ground, the economic and political realities on the ground, were forcing the Jews to be in different difficult places between warring factions within cities and within areas. We know that the Jews were expelled from England in 1290. In 1298, the Jews were killed and expelled from many different places in Germany. We have a number of different events in France during the early 14th century. The Jews were expelled in 1306, then they were let back in again. They were expelled again in 1322, and they were finally expelled in 1394. There were a number of other persecutions during the early 14th century that were all leading up to the Black Death. And what I'm trying to say is that what happened during the Black Death wasn't sudden, it wasn't out of nowhere. This was part of ongoing events. The other thing that should be said about the early 14th century is that this was a period of tremendous economic and ecological crisis. This was a period of tremendous drought, of rising prices of grain, of years in which the fields were not producing the produce that they had been used to producing, after the 13th century, which is considered a period of plenty. So we also have economic and ecological change going on before this disease hits medieval Europe. So on this background, we have the events of the mid-14th century when the plague hits Europe. The Jews, like their neighbors, hear that the plague is coming close from travelers who are coming through the cities. And I think what should be said is that there are a number of myths and realities before we start to talk about what happened during these years. I would say that there are perhaps two main myths I want to address here. One is that no Jews died during the Black Death. This is not true. We have tombstones that talk about Jews who died during the Black Death. You'll see in some of the quotes I bring in a minute how different writers of the period treat this. There's no way we can say that Jews were not harmed during the Black Death from the plague itself. The other myth was a myth that was sent around during that period, and that was the idea that the Jews were poisoning the wells, and that is why the plague was hitting the cities, and we'll be talking about that during our series over the next few weeks. So what actually happened during this period? Like I said, very often, almost always, communities knew that there was a plague and the plague was approaching. In many cases, we know that they decided to do something with the Jews of the city months before the plague reached the city. So we're not always talking about a response to the plague, we're talking about a response to a plague that is coming near, that is coming up. And if we look at that same map I showed you just a few minutes ago, you can see all the communities that were hit during the plague. So from this perspective, you can see how widespread it was. You can see how many Jewish communities there already were in this very small area of Germany. And of course, this could be broadened. And you can also see how many of them were attacked during this period. Very few communities in Northern Europe were left untouched. So what do we know about the Black Death? The first thing to say is that we don't have very many Jewish reports. If the Jews were either expelled or killed, they didn't always have the opportunity to leave behind information about what had happened to them. So the sources we have are sometimes Christian sources that talk about what happened, and sometimes Jewish sources that are written sometime after the events or accounting different aspects of the events. What I want to do in the next few minutes is bring a few examples of these sources to give you a taste of them. We'll be coming back to them in the next few weeks as well. So here is one source that's actually from a much later period, from the early modern times, written by Yosef HaKohen, who wrote a book, The Valley of Tears, that describes many of the different hardships and attacks the Jews experienced during the medieval period. And he writes what he does based on a book that was written in the 14th century, but that hasn't survived, and we only have through his mediation. And this book tells as follows: and it happened in 5108, in 1348, there was a heavy plague from the east, and there was not a city that escaped it, as is written in Emek Rephaim by Rabbi Chaim Galipapa in those days. And there was a cry from one end of the earth to the other, like none ever before. And from a city of 1,000, 100 remained. And from a city of 100, 10 remained in those times. And for each person who fell sick or died from the Jews, 100 non-Jews died. And they became consumed with zealousness, and one couldn't speak to them peacefully. So Yosef HaKohen expresses the idea that many more non-Jews died than Jews, although he does not say that Jews did not die. And like I told you, we do have tombstones that provide evidence that Jews did die during the plague. And he also talks about the zealousness, about the animosity between Jews and Christians during this period. The second source I want to bring you is one written by a Christian during this period. And he tells as follows: in some places, people believed that the Jews poisoned the world and therefore killed them. In others, handicapped paupers were accused and driven away. In others, nobles, and thus they had to travel through the land. So what we see here is that the well poisoning accusation wasn't specifically against Jews, although over time it did become more and more specifically Jewish. We have lepers who are accused of it, we have paupers, we have nobles, and these were accusations that we already are familiar with in the early 14th century. And he continues and tells us, this Guy de Chauliac, eventually it came to pass that guards were posted in cities and villages and did not allow anyone to enter unless they knew him well. And if they found anyone with powders or ointments, they made him swallow them, since they feared these may be potions. Here a word should be said about these accusations, and it should be said that in many places there were people who tried to protect the Jews. There were rulers of the cities or people with whom they had agreements who tried to argue that this was an accusation that didn't make sense. So much like we today can talk about it as a myth, in the Middle Ages already, there were people who did not believe this accusation. But in other places, we know that the Jews were taken and they were interrogated and they were asked questions as part of a judicial trial, and in some cases often forced to confess. So we have a wide variety of experiences during this period, and each city really has its own story. And one of the things that scholars have suggested, and one of them is a member of our team, Dr. Tzafrir Barzilai, is that in order to understand what happened during this period, you really have to look at each community and understand what the relations were on the ground. But one of the things that Dr. Barzilai found in his research is that in many of the cases, these accusations were made long before, and I mean months before, the plague actually reached the city. So we can see that what was happening here with the Jews was part of other local politics and not just related to the plague. The plague maybe set this in motion, but it was just part of a larger group of factors. So in some cities, the Jews were protected by local protectors. In other cities, they were expelled. And in some cities, they were brought to trial and they were set on fire. Sometimes without a trial, they were rounded up and brought to be put on fire. And we can hear this here in another source written by a Christian at the same time. In 1347, there was such a great pestilence and mortality through almost the whole world. Some people say that the Jews planned to wipe out all the Christians with poison and had poisoned wells and springs everywhere. And many Jews confessed as much under torture, that they had bred spiders and toads in pots and pans and had obtained poison from overseas, and that not every Jew knew about this wickedness, only the more powerful ones, so that it would not be betrayed. As evidence of this heinous crime, men say that bags full of poison were found in many wells and springs, and as a result, in cities, towns, and villages throughout Germany, and in fields and woods too, almost all the wells and springs have been blocked up or built over so that no one can drink from them or use the water for cooking, and men have to use rain or river water instead. Now, as you can already tell from the tone of voice in this source, the author himself has some doubts about whether or not this was actually happening. He says some Jews confessed as much under torture. He says some people say that the Jews planned to wipe out all the Christians. In other words, he himself has his doubts, and he continues. God, the Lord of vengeance, has not suffered the malice of the Jews to go unpunished. Throughout Germany, in all but a few places, they were burnt. For fear of that punishment, many accepted baptism, and their lives were spared. This action was taken against the Jews in 1349, and it still continues unabated, for in a number of regions, many people, noble and humble alike, have laid plans against them and their defenders, which they will never abandon until the whole Jewish race has been destroyed. So we can hear about what's going on in different places, and perhaps I should have mentioned this before as well, the other reaction of many Jews converting, accepting baptizing during this period. And this is really the different kinds of options that existed when the Jews were attacked during this period. So how did the Jews react? We have reports from different places. The report from Basel tells us, and I paraphrased it here, all the Jews in Basel were burnt, except for the children who were taken from them and baptized. They went to their death, some of them dancing, some singing and reciting psalms, and some crying. In Esslingen, we hear that the Jews set fire to their homes, their synagogue, and themselves. And in other places we hear, many Jews closed their doors, set fire to themselves when they saw what their fate would be. And in the cities of the emperor, the Jews' houses were destroyed. From these stones and tombstones, towers and fortifications were built. In Fulda, we even hear that the Jews attacked the Christians. When they realized they were about to be burnt, they tried to burn their Christian neighbors. What I'm trying to suggest is that we don't have a passive response. Even the Jews who are led to the fire to be burnt, we hear that some of them went dancing, some singing and reciting psalms, and some crying. So they were having an active response in this moment. And we also hear of the Jews setting fire to their homes, and in the case of Fulda, even something much more violent. So we can see that this complicated relationship between the Jews and their neighbors comes across not just in reaction to what the Jewish place is when the plague is about to strike the city, but also in the way the Jews respond to what is being done to them. So what I have tried to do in these very brief moments is tell you a very complicated story in about 20 minutes. I tried to tell you the story of a Jewish community or Jewish communities throughout Northern Europe that lived comfortably, that felt like they were part of their surroundings, even though there were anti-Jewish sentiments against them during the 12th and 13th century. I wanted to tell you about the change as the 13th century came to a close that led up to the 14th century. And when the plague struck, all of these factors came together with horrific results. In each case, in each city, we can learn about what led to these events, but we can also see them as a whole. And I think this really should ring familiar to many of us today when we think about different tensions in the world that are coming to kind of a hilt as the pandemic spread throughout the world, different problems that are becoming more pronounced and more noticed. In the case in which the Jews were a minority culture, again, amongst the majority that really would have been happier to have the Jews convert, we can see how their comfortable living or their everyday lives became completely shooken up during a period of pandemic and of death. How do we learn about the Black Death and the Jews, or how do we learn about Jewish life in the Middle Ages? I made a list here of all kinds of sources from which we can learn these things. And what we'd like to do in the rest of these series, in today's episode and what you'll hear from now on, and in what we'll do over the next 3 weeks, is talk about a lot of these different kinds of sources. What we want to do is present to you the lives of the Jews before, during, and after the Black Death, and ask a number of questions of them. We want to know something about the economy before, something about the politics before, because as was very clear from what I said now, the local politics and the local economy were very important for understanding what happened during this period. We want to know something about Jewish culture and the way the Jews responded to the culture around them. In the case of the Black Death, we'll be talking about how they responded to death. And we want to know what happened after the Black Death, after the Jews were expelled or communities were destroyed. Some of those communities came back. I think that's perhaps one of the most interesting questions we're dealing with today, which is what happens the moment after? When looking at the Jewish communities of the Middle Ages, we want to ask what happened when they came back to those same cities from which they were expelled or in which their communities were destroyed, and how did they respond coming back to those same settings? Did their lives change completely? Did the rules, did the laws that govern their lives change? What we're going to do in the next few episodes is have the different members of my team present their research. Each of them is a specialist on different types of sources, and each of them works with different materials. You can see on the Beit Avichai website what the program is and what each episode will be about. And today I'd like to invite Dr. Eyal Levinson, one of the postdocs in our group, to tell us a little bit about the lives of the Jews before the Black Death. But Eyal will be telling this from a very specific perspective. He will be telling us about the archeological findings and how these archeological findings allow us to understand Jewish life. These findings are the result of the Black Death. He'll be telling us about communities that were destroyed in 1349, and from the ruins of these communities, we can work backwards and understand what existed in these communities before this destruction. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Eyal. I'd like to invite questions from all of you via the chat, and Eyal and I will stop a few minutes before the end of this hour and try to answer the questions that you're sending our way. Eyal, please take over.
Okay, thank you very much. First, thank you, Beit Avichai, for this wonderful opportunity to share what we do in our daily lives. Thank you also for the people who prepared us for this meeting. There's a lot of work going into it, so I appreciate that. And so far, we heard from Professor Baumgarten like a general overview of what happened before and during the plague. My presentation today will focus on one community. We'll go deep inside one community. We'll get to know this community. And let me share my screen with you. Hold on. Share screen. View. So my presentation today is titled Chivalric Culture and Jewish Daily Life in Ashkenaz Before the Black Death. And it will focus on a Jewish community of Cologne in Germany, a community that, like many other contemporary Jewish communities, suffered the devastating results of the pogroms associated with the Black Death. I will present 3 archeological findings and discuss what these objects reveal about the daily lives of the victims and about the influences of chivalric culture on Ashkenazi Jews. But first, let us begin with some background information on this medieval Jewish community. The medieval Jewish quarter in Cologne was established probably in the late 10th or early 11th century. It was located west of the Old Market and right at the heart of this medieval commercial hub. That's what we heard from Professor Baumgarten, and here is an example of it, right at the center of this commercial hub. The Jews played an important role in the city's economy. They were an integral part of its daily life and were allowed to reside wherever they chose. Bear in mind that during the Middle Ages, Cologne was one of the largest cities north of the Alps. In the early 11th century, a richly decorated synagogue was constructed, and about the same time, a hospital was built by a philanthropist named Eliakim ben Mordechai. It functioned as a communal and charitable institution for the sick, the elderly, and for pilgrims. The essential rights and privileges of the city's Jews were repeatedly regulated in letters of protection acquired for a substantial amount of money. Here is an inscription of the Jewish privilege from 1266 granted by Archbishop Engelbert von Falkenburg and engraved on the wall of Cologne's cathedral. The community was administered by a chief rabbi, officially called the Episcopus Judaeorum, or the Jewish bishop, who was elected annually and was assisted by a council of Dayanim, or Jewish judges, who enjoyed exclusive jurisdiction over cases involving Jews and Jews. The city's Jews were engaged in a variety of economic activities, including money lending and commerce, trading especially in wool, leather, fur, and jewelry. They could even hold public offices. In 1349, this thriving Jewish community was completely destroyed in a pogrom associated with the Black Death. A museum is currently being built on the ruins of the medieval Jewish quarter, as you can see here. This project is conducted and supervised by an interdisciplinary team of experts and advisors led by Thomas Otten. And among these advisors are Professor Ephraim Shoam Steiner of Ben-Gurion University, Professor Elizabeth Hollander of the Goethe University Frankfurt, and Professor Judith Olshow-Bischlager of the École Pratique des Hautes-Études in Paris. The Makua LVR Jewish Museum in Archeological Quarter Cologne is located right in front of Cologne's historical city hall. And with its synagogue, ritual bath, and other community buildings and private houses, it is the most preserved medieval Jewish neighborhood in Germany. These buildings were, as was the whole Jewish community, an inseparable part of Cologne's medieval landscape before the plague. According to Tanya Pothoff and Michael Vihen, two archaeologists who are part of the Makua team, the massacre of the local Jews occurred 4 months before the first victims of the plagues were detected in the city. There too we heard from Professor Baumgarten about the rumors coming, knowing that it's coming. It happened on San Bartholomew's Day, the night of August 23 and 24, 1349, only 3 weeks before Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. A prosperous Jewish community well integrated into this bustling medieval city of approximately 40 to 50,000 inhabitants was now completely destroyed. Its members were either murdered by the local population or took their own lives. Some Jews burned themselves alive in the synagogue, which stood not only next to the historical city hall, but also 5 minutes walking distance from Cologne's magnificent cathedral. You can see this, the synagogue is there at the bottom with the blue dot and the cathedral on top. 5 minutes walking distance. Then fire broke out simultaneously in different parts of the city, of the quarter. The pogrom is currently understood by scholars as the end of an escalating hostility towards the Jews during the first half of the 14th century, notwithstanding repeated attempts to protect them by the city council and the archbishop. Pothoff and Vihen explained that a few years before the pogrom, the situation of the Jewish community in Cologne seemed to have been so tense that in its letter of protection from 1342, the city council emphasized, sorry about that. The city council emphasized that it could only protect the Jews to the extent that it could. Archbishop of Cologne, Walram von Jülich, had already promised the residents of the city in a letter of protection from the same year that they should suffer no disadvantages or damages from protecting the Jews. You see, without the protection of the authorities, the fate was now sealed for the 75 Jewish households and the many refugees who escaped the pogroms in neighboring towns and hoped to find shelter in the city. This tragedy, however, left behind valuable historical information about the lives of the victims before the plague, before 1349, about their dwellings and housing arrangements, their communal institutions, their culinary habits, and their material culture. These remains, as we will soon see, also hold some information about how chivalry culture was an integral part of their daily lives. Before we turn to the 3 findings, bear in mind that these artifacts survived the pogrom, the looting accompanying the massacre, and the extremely hot blazes that turned the whole quarter into ashes. The first item I want to share with you is a chainmail, one of several chainmail shirts found in a cellar of a Jewish home. The damages caused by the fire are still detectable. It melted a little bit, as you can see. The archaeologists are still unclear whether this chainmail was private property, merchandise, obtained by a pledge, or even the remains of any fighting that may have taken place during the pogrom. The French chronicler Gilles Lemouzy wrote that the city's Jews had armed themselves and offered bitter resistance to the Christians. Although his report is taken by historians with a grain of salt, the idea that armed Jews protected themselves may not come to us as a surprise. As residents who could carry weapons, Cologne's Jews were obliged to defend the city fortification. In 1112, for instance, they were assigned to protect one of the city's gates, and again in 1331, they were granted a letter of protection by the city council, which included their duty to guard and defend the so-called Jewish gate whenever the city was attacked. We also know that during the struggles between the municipality of Cologne and the Archbishop Konrad von Hochstaden, Jewish men courageously defended the city alongside the Christian neighbors against the Archbishop's troops. The municipality showed its gratitude by including them in the peace treaty of March 1252. In 1146, during the Second Crusade, Cologne's Jews rented the castle of Wolkenburg near Bonn from the Archbishop to protect themselves there. The Jewish chronicler Ephraim, son of Jacob of Bonn, was among the Jews who fled to the castle. He was 13 years old when it happened, and here is his report about it, what he remembered many years later. And the majority of the Cologne community gave the Archbishop of Cologne a great fortune so he could give them the castle of Wolkenburg, which nothing like it stands in the land of Lotharingia. And they made the burglary of the castle leave by giving him many presents, and they themselves were in the castle, and no stranger, no uncircumcised man remained there with them. And when the Christians heard that the castle was given to the Jews, and that they all gathered there, they ceased from chasing them. You see, it makes no sense for the escapees to remain in this castle all by themselves, without any protection, unless there were Jewish fighters among them. Jewish fighters were not only in Cologne. The documents indicate that during the High and Late Middle Ages, Jews armed with their weapons often fought against rioters, robbers, and crusaders. Already in Mainz in May 1096, when during the First Crusade, Count Emicho of Leiningen arrived with a large army to the gates of the city, Jewish men wearing armor and carrying weapons fought for their lives. Professor Alfred Haverkamp mentions that in February 1201, the Jews of Worms defended the city together with the other citizens, even on a Sabbath. And in 1309, the Jews of Erfurt participated in the defense of their hometown. As you can see, during the High and Late Middle Ages, there were Jewish fighters in Cologne and in other communities in Germany. These men knew how to fight. They were probably trained for it. And they had their own weapons, shields, and chainmail gear. Some of them were rewarded for their fighting skills and courage. The second artifact I want to share with you today is a slate on which a drawing of a knight riding a horse is etched. This is one of many slates found by the Makua team on which appear various drawings, writing exercises in Hebrew, as you can see in this one, and also lists of Hebrew names with amounts of money next to each one. As you can see that. Still not sure what that was. And hopefully there's some suggestions like money borrowing, somebody who had it, there's a hole here. Supposedly it was maybe hanging somewhere on the wall or on a belt or wherever. Finding a drawing of a knight on one of these slates should not surprise us either. There are many illustrations of knights riding horses in Hebrew manuscripts. Here are two examples. Two knights, one on top, two knights fighting each other in a tournament from an Italian manuscript, and a micrography from around the same time from Germany, showing an armed knight on a horseback approaching a castle. There are many illustrations like that. And now we turn to the last artifact that I will present today, and was found in the pit underneath the women's synagogue. It is a toy made of tin and lead of a knight riding a galloping horse. Knightly toys were quite favorite at that time. And apparently they are still popular nowadays. What I find remarkable about this finding is that it shows that Jewish children too were fascinated with knights, and that at least some parents thought that such a toy was well suited for their children. A similar toy made of clay was also unearthed by the Makua team. These three artifacts, the chainmail, the slate, and the toy, show that medieval urban culture, and especially chivalry, were part of everyday life of Ashkenazi Jews, adults and children alike. Influences of chivalry culture on these Jews can be found in a variety of written sources, in illustrations of Hebrew manuscripts, and on wall paintings, and in archeological findings like these. Let us conclude by remembering the victims of the Black Death pogrom, also as citizens who contributed to the prosperity of their cities, who defended their towns alongside their Christian neighbors, whose lives intertwined with those of their neighbors, who dressed like them, shared the language, heard the same stories and legends, and sang the same melodies. And yet, remained to the last day a distinguished and vulnerable other against which one could easily incite the masses. I don't know if any of the victims of 1349, just before he or she died, uttered the words, "I can't breathe." But for me, the hatred that killed them was very similar to the one that ended the life of George Floyd of blessed memory. May the memory of all victims of hatred guide us to a better future. Thank you.
I will end with a different picture from the findings from a different place during the Black Death before we open for questions. These are for the findings from Erfurt, where you can see what was found in a cellar, probably left by a Jew who was escaping the city and leaving his valuables behind. And you can see here a large collection of coins, of cups, of goblets, of jewelry, of different things that he had. We don't know if this person was a rich man who lent money and these were pawns, or if these were his own belongings, perhaps a mixture of both. I think that you can see through the archeological findings that Eyal just showed us, and through what I'm showing you just now, some of the material culture of these people left behind. And Eyal's presentation spotlighted different aspects of living in part of the city, and really of a reality that is much more complicated than Jewish hatred or Jewish acceptance, but really a reality of living together and living apart, one in which the Jews were both part of their surroundings, but at the same time also a minority, a targeted minority, and what happened at boiling points and at times of crisis, the Black Death being one of the most noted and the most violent, and also with the greatest consequences of them. What I want to do now is I want to try to answer some of the questions that we had on the chat, and then perhaps to try to conclude this series. I'm going to stop the share so that we can see each other and I can see the chat. So there are a few questions here on the chat. Maybe I'll take a few of them and then Eyal will take others of them. One of the questions is, what do we know about when the Jews came to settle in medieval Ashkenaz? The first findings we have from that period of this settlement are from the 9th and 10th century, when we hear about merchants who come and receive permission to settle in these areas. They often come as 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 families and receive permissions from the rulers in those places. Those permissions usually include how they will be judged, in other words, what the legal status will be, where they're allowed to live, if they're given a place for a cemetery. They're given the basic parameters of their lives in those places. We imagine that most of the Jews came to Germany from France. We know that some of them came from Italy. We have a lot of Italian families and Italian family names living in medieval Ashkenaz. So that's an answer to the first question. We don't know exactly when the Jews settled in France, but our first knowledge of them is from around the same time. And we do know that in Italy, we have Jews much earlier, stretching back already to the period of the destruction of the Second Temple and before. A second question we have here is, were the Jews of Cologne attacked during the Crusades? The Jews of Cologne were attacked during the First Crusades, much like many of the other communities along the Rhineland. We know that those communities right after the Crusades, in which some people died or killed themselves, others were baptized or accepted baptism, they were allowed by the imperial edicts of the time to return to Judaism. And we know that they rebuilt their communities. In fact, one of the questions that scholars debate is to what extent was this actually a great blow on the communities, or was it a passing episode? In other words, how great were the effects of the First Crusade? And during the period between the First Crusade and the Black Death, so from the end of the 11th century until the mid-14th century, we know of other events that happened that in which the Jews in the Rhineland were persecuted. We also know of peaceful and successful everyday life ongoing there. Eyal, do you want to take the next questions?
Okay. The question is, if Jews were accused of causing the plague in Europe, how did it happen that the Jewish community of Cologne was destroyed before the plague hit Cologne? As Professor Baumgarten mentioned in her talk at the beginning, many times the rumors came to the towns, sometimes months before, as happened in Cologne. The pogrom was like 4 months before the first people were detected in the town. And there we see that the tension that was building up from throughout the first half of the 14th century, and the city council trying to prevent, and the archbishop trying to prevent any bloodshed or any harm for the Jews. Eventually, when the rumors started to reach the town, there was no chance. And it's a repeated phenomenon that happened in other places as well. The Jews, the pogroms were taking place before actually the plague arrived. And I guess it's the fear. It's a lot of other things, the tension, the religious tension that so easy to incite the masses to follow a certain path. Any other questions that? Elisheva, any other questions you want to answer?
There's one more question, the question about Natan Tokef. So I think this is a very interesting example. The Natan Tokef piyut that we say on the high holidays is actually a piyut that was written in late antiquity, far away from Europe. And we know that it's a piyut that existed long before any of the events in medieval Ashkenaz that we're talking about today. The first mention we have of this piyut and its connection to the high holidays is in a 13th century halachic book that tells the story of a certain Rabbi Amnon of Mainz. This Rabbi Amnon living more or less before the First Crusade. Scholars have argued that this Rabbi Amnon did not exist. His name itself tells you that he's a typological figure, Amnon coming from Emunah. And among the scholars who've analyzed this story is Professor Ivan Marcus from Yale University, who's talked about how this piyut became part of the ritual in medieval Ashkenaz, the story behind it being a story that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and the story being the story of Rabbi Amnon, who was tempted to convert, and or rather he was asked to convert by the Christian authorities time after time, and one time, instead of saying no, he said, I'll think about it for a few days. And Professor Marcus describes this as perhaps his own temptation to convert. When the Christians came back after 3 days, Rabbi Amnon said, I do not want to convert, I want to stay Jewish. And then he was punished by the Christians, and the story is very gory with his limbs being cut off. After he dies, according to the story, he came back to one of his disciples and instructed him to say this piyut every year. So that is the story behind the piyut. Like I said, the scholars don't think this story actually ever happened. And Professor Marcus suggested that the fact that Amnon debated, contemplated, even if it was just something he said, he contemplated conversion. He said, I'll think about it. That's a telling sign of what the Jews were going through during this period. And I think this relates very nicely to some of the things we talked about today. In other words, part of what we were trying to describe is not a Jewish community completely alienated from their Christian neighbors, and not neighbors who are completely alienated from the Jews, although the results we're talking about today are very hard and harsh results. We're talking about Jews who lived within their surroundings, felt very comfortable there, and were very much a part of them. And at certain points, they were even tempted. If you go back to the picture Eyal showed you of the Cologne Cathedral overlooking, overshadowing everything in that city, you can imagine how tempting conversion actually was, how tempting Christianity could have been for the Jews living in that city. So we have a complicated reality here, and what happened in the Black Death was one result of that reality, and it was part of a very long process. But what we're trying to study as a group is how to understand both this kind of black and white process that we see at crucial and also very extreme events such as the Black Death, alongside the everyday life in which life went on and the Jews had their place next door to the Christians. I think if I were to try to summarize what we did today and really try to connect it to what we're seeing today, is to try to understand how complicated realities in the past were and responses to extreme moments such as pandemic were, and to use some of this insight into understanding what's happening around us today. We are more or less towards the end of our time. If there are no other questions, are there any other questions anyone would like to ask? Eyal, would you like to add something?
Elisheva, there's a very interesting question from Professor Baumgarten, which maybe you can see if you can be challenged with. The question is, why was baptism considered an acceptable alternative to execution when the Jews were suspected of causing the plague?
So I think that in some places it wasn't considered an acceptable alternative. In other words, in some cases the Jews were rounded up and they were put on pyre and they were burnt, and there was no other choice. In other places, when the issues at heart were really local issues and we had tensions between different people, that's when baptism was considered acceptable. And that's when the local factions were warring over the Jews. And the Jews were, in some ways, in the different cities, loyal to different ruling classes or to different ruling parts of the city. And they often sided with the bishop or they sided with the emperor. And they were protected by them as well. And in those cases, if they were willing to change sides and be part of different groups in the city, they could be baptized and find their place there. I see there are a few other questions here, so perhaps I can answer them before we sign off. So how many Jews lived in Northern Europe early in the 14th century? We don't actually know how many Jews there were. We're talking about a few tens of thousands of Jews. We're not talking about 100,000s, and we're not talking about millions of Jews. We do know that there were other groups that were attacked preemptively. Certainly in the early 14th century, you have many examples of attacks on lepers that were also considered very harmful to society and someone who would bring in poison, and other dangerous elements of society. And we also know that paupers in some places were blamed, so people who were from out of the city, strangers, people who were not inhabitants of the city. So we see a lot of suspect of the other, whoever that other may be. Over time, the Jew became the ultimate other in many different ways. In medieval Europe, and the Black Death is an example of such. And Eyal, there's one other question that I think is for you before we end up.
Which one is that? How many Jews?
The last one from Daniela Maurer. When do they plan on reconstructing? What do they plan on reconstructing the museum you spoke about?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question because it was supposed to open, I think, in 2021, and now maybe it will be postponed a little bit. Look them up. The Makua LVR site. You can learn a lot about that project. It's a fascinating project, and we're all looking forward for it to open. Our group had a fascinating workshop with them. 5 of them came here, showed us some stuff. We visited the place itself, and it seems that it will be a place for all of us to go and visit whenever it opens. So I want to add one thing that to emphasize what Elisheva said a few times is that each community experienced something different. We have to remember that. There are many, many communities throughout Ashkenaz at that time, and each crusade, each time, there was a different experience of whether saved, protected by the archbishop, protected by the townspeople, or massacred, or different experiences. So it's important to study those communities in isolation and then to join, the big puzzle together. And thank you, Beit Avichai. It was a very enjoyable talk, and I appreciate it very much.
Okay, so maybe thank you very much, Eyal. Thank you to Beit Avichai, to Tamar, to Bruria, to everyone who helped us today, and to all of you for joining us. Alan asked one last question, which I'll respond to again, and I think I'll do that by inviting you to the next lectures. You say here that I'm speaking as if the Jews were accepted by their Christian neighbors. At some points there were. We have Jews and Christians who cooperate through business, in everyday culture, in everyday dealings. And we also have other moments in which their otherness became so evident and there was no way in which they could live together, such as the example we talked about today, this extreme example. I can only invite you back to the next sessions. Next week, we'll be talking a little bit more about the Black Death to give a little bit more of a feeling of what happened during that period. And 2 members of our team, 2 doctoral students, Hannah, who we call Teddy, so Hannah Teddy Schachter, and Miri Fenton, will be speaking about death and dancing. And they'll be talking about different responses to the Black Death and how Jewish customs changed in light of the Black Death. The following week, Alan, maybe you'll get your answer if you ask that question, which is when we'll speak about the economy, those kinds of partnerships between Jews and Christians, and the dissolution of those partnerships as well. And finally, in our last session, we'll be talking about how the Jews came back to these cities and what we find in these cities on the ground and in the writings that Jews wrote when they came back. What was important to them? Did life look the same as it did before they left? Those are some of the questions we'll leave for next time. And we look forward to answering more questions as we go along. Thank you very much.